My ex-wife spent 14 months building a version of me that didn't exist, not all at once. Slowly, with the same quiet precision she used to manage the financials of the hospital network where she worked as CFO. First, it was at family dinners, then in conversations with the kids, then in statements to her attorney, and finally, on a Thursday afternoon in October, with the fluorescent lights humming above the Davidson County Circuit Court Family Division in Nashville, Tennessee, she stood up in front of a judge I'd never seen in my life and said, in that voice of hers that never once cracked, "He can barely make rent, Your Honor. My children need stability. My husband can give them a real home." Caleb, my son, 11 years old, looked down at his hands. Emma, 8, started crying. I didn't say a word. Then the judge opened a sealed envelope that had arrived by official courier 2 days earlier, read it in silence for about 4 minutes, and looked up at me over his glasses with an expression I couldn't read. "Mr. Mercer," his voice was low, "do you know why the Department of Defense has a file on you that's been classified for 22 years? Connie stopped writing in her legal pad. Her attorney turned to look at her. She looked at me, and I thought, here we go. But before I tell you what happened next, I need to explain who I am. Because this story doesn't start in that courtroom. It starts a long time before that, in a 2-bedroom apartment off Nolensville Pike, Nashville, on a Monday morning when I was frying eggs and my life still made some kind of sense. My name is Dale Mercer. I'm 51 years old. I work as an industrial maintenance technician at a manufacturing plant off Interstate 24 in Smyrna, about 30 miles southeast of the city. I'm up every morning at 5:15. I take the highway in the dark. I come home around 6:30 with grease on my knuckles and the same work boots I've had for 3 years. For anyone who doesn't know me, there's not much more to say. For anyone who does, there are 22 more years of history, but that part stayed classified. I've been renting an apartment in the Wedgwood, Houston neighborhood since the separation became official about 18 months ago. It's small. 2 bedrooms, a living room, a back porch that looks out over a parking lot, and if you angle your chair right, a sliver of the Cumberland River. The smaller bedroom has a bunk bed I bought secondhand off Facebook Marketplace, a rug with cartoon foxes that Emma picked out, and a shelf where Caleb keeps his baseball cards in stacks. He's always reorganizing into systems I don't fully understand but pretend to. Every other weekend, they sleep here. That's what I had. That's what was on the line. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. Subscribe. These stories aren't about revenge. They're about dignity, about what a man does when someone decides to write his story before asking who he is. Hit the like button, leave a comment, because right now I need to take you back 14 months to when everything started shifting in a way I hadn't learned to see yet. It was a Sunday, early March, last year. I'd picked the kids up at 10 in the morning from Connie's place. She was living in a house in Brentwood, good school district, HOA, the whole thing. She'd remarried 9 months after we finalized the divorce, a man named Scott Alderman, who was a regional sales director for a medical device company and who wore zip-up performance fleeces on weekends like it was a uniform. The kids liked Scott. I never knew quite what to do with that. That Sunday, I picked them up, took them to Shelby Park to throw the ball around, and stopped at a barbecue place on Gallatin Pike on the way back, the one Emma calls the real one to distinguish it from a chain by the same name. On the drive to drop them off, Caleb said something from the back seat without looking up from his phone. "Dad, are you doing okay with money?" I told him I was fine. "Why?" "Mom said you were having a hard time." I glanced at him in the rear view. He wasn't looking at me. His thumb kept moving on the screen. "When did she say that?" "I don't know. Recently." I didn't say anything else. Kept driving. The afternoon sun was coming in flat off the windshield, and I was too warm for about 2 minutes. Dropped them off at the end of the driveway. Waited until I saw the front door close behind them. Pulled away. That day, it seemed like a bitter comment. Divorced people say things. It happens. I knew Connie had stopped loving me a long time ago, probably longer than I wanted to admit, but until then, I'd believed she had a line, that the kids stayed on the other side of it. They didn't. Connie Harwell Mercer was 47 years old and the chief financial officer of a regional hospital network based in Nashville. She was good at what she did, not in the corporate sense, but in the real sense. She saw patterns where other people saw chaos. She anticipated problems before they became crises. She rarely got flustered by anything that could be solved by the following Tuesday. For the first 7 years of our marriage, I admired that. It was the same quality that steadied me when things got hard, and they got hard the way they do for everyone. 17 years together. We got married when I was 34. She was 31. Caleb came 2 years after. Emma, 3 years after Caleb. We had a habit of drinking coffee on the back porch every Saturday morning. She always wanted it weaker than I made it, and I always forgot, and she always drank it anyway, without saying much. That went on for maybe 12 years. Doesn't sound like much, but when you lose it, you feel it. The crack I ignored too long showed up when Emma was about 4. Connie came back from a work conference in Atlanta and was different. Not angry, not distant. Different, like someone who'd gone somewhere and hadn't fully come back. I asked once. She said she was just tired. I believed her. Kept believing it for another 2 years, until she sat on the edge of the bed one Wednesday night and said she needed to figure out what she wanted. We separated 7 months later. No big scene. A lot of paperwork. Joint custody. We worked it out between us. No court involved. I thought we'd handled it right. I was wrong. That Sunday at the park, I still didn't know what was being built. I found out 5 weeks later when I got a call from her attorney at a time attorneys don't call, 7:20 in the morning on a Friday. Mr. Mercer, my client is seeking a custody modification. She intends to request sole physical custody with supervised visitation for you. I went quiet. I had coffee in my hand. I set the mug on the counter because it suddenly weighed more than it should. On what grounds? My voice came out level. I don't know how. Financial and emotional instability per my client. Financial and emotional instability. I hung up, went to the bathroom, ran cold water on my face, stood at the mirror for about 40 seconds. I thought, okay, it's not true. Things that aren't true fall apart in front of evidence. What I didn't know was how long Connie had been building the evidence before making that call. Working backward with Phil weeks later, we pieced together a rough timeline. The conversations with the kids' teachers had started around July, 4 months before the attorney's call. The neighbor and doctor declarations had been arranged sometime in August and September. The private therapist had been brought in during October. The call came in November. 4 months of quiet construction. While I was picking up the kids on weekends, while we were eating barbecue on Gallatin Pike, while Emma was showing me her drawings, and Caleb was explaining the rules of whatever card game he was deep into that month, while all of that was happening, there was a parallel process running that I couldn't see because I wasn't looking. I should have been looking. I wasn't. It took 3 days to understand the full shape of what I was looking at. But before those 3 days, let me tell you what happened that night. I hung up the phone, went to the kitchen, washed the glass that had been sitting dirty since breakfast, rinsed it slow, put it in the rack, went to the kids' room. Emma had taped a drawing to the door, and Laniki in Morni, in Morm, in Lorn, in Morn. A house with a tree out front, crayons, and her second-grade handwriting at the bottom. Dad's house. The bunk bed was made. Caleb's backpack was in the corner, with one cleat sticking out sideways that he always left behind. I stood in the doorway about 2 minutes. Then I showered, lay down, and stared at the ceiling until 2 in the morning. It wasn't anger that kept me up. It was the slow, building clarity, like when you've been in a dark room long enough that you start to make out the furniture, the clarity that what had just happened wasn't impulsive. She hadn't called her attorney because we'd argued. She hadn't decided this the week before. This had been planned. It took 3 days to understand how long it had been in the works. The first day, I found out she had spoken to the kids' teachers about concerns with the home environment at Dad's. I don't know what she said exactly. I just know that Emma's teacher looked at me differently at the next school event. The second day, Caleb texted me at 11 at night, well past when he should have been asleep, and told me in lowercase, like he was trying to keep it small, that his mom had asked him to write down when Dad gets upset or talks about money. He put a question mark at the end. 11 years old. He was warning me. The third day, her attorney sent over a document containing statements from a doctor I'd never visited, from a neighbor in my building I'd barely spoken to, describing a man who drank alone, who became agitated, who struggled to maintain basic routines. I went to the window of my living room. The parking lot below was empty. It was late on a Tuesday, and the light had that flat gray color the sky gets in Nashville in the fall when the sun doesn't quite make it through. I lay down on the couch. Couldn't eat anything. Couldn't sleep that night either. But I didn't call anyone to vent. Didn't curse anyone out. Didn't text Connie in the heat of the moment. I just lay there staring at the ceiling until about 1:30, thinking about something my grandfather told me once when I was in middle school and something at school had gone sideways. He said, "Dale, the man who goes off first loses every time." So I didn't go off. Next morning, I was up at 5:15, same as always, brushed my teeth, drank my coffee, got on I-24. Connie was building a character. What she didn't know was that characters collapse when the real man decides to show up. But before I showed up, I needed to know what she knew about me, and what she didn't. That difference was going to be everything. That same weekend, Saturday morning, I walked down the hall and knocked on the door of apartment 114. Earl Whitfield was 69 years old, widowed 3 years prior, and had spent 31 years as an engineer at the Tennessee Valley Authority before retiring. He was a quiet man, tall, white-haired, the kind of posture that comes from decades of reading blueprints at a standing desk. Direct eyes, no wasted words. We'd fallen into a habit of having coffee together a morning here and there since I'd moved in. Not a close friendship by design, just the kind of thing that happens when two men live on the same floor and neither one is the type to be a nuisance. He took his coffee black, didn't watch talk shows, and had an opinion about most things, but kept it to himself unless someone asked. I knocked with the folder of documents in my hand. He opened up, looked at me, looked at the folder, and said, "Come on in. Pot's still hot." We sat at his kitchen table, which had a plastic placemat with a faded Great Smoky Mountains print that had been there since before I moved in. I told him everything. It took about 40 minutes. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he was quiet for about 20 seconds. Not the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, but of someone ordering what they're going to say. "You got an attorney?" he asked. I did. I'd retained one the week before, a family law attorney named Phil Brower, recommended by a guy at work, somewhere around 50, with a small office in the Midtown area. What's Phil saying about the declarations? That declarations aren't evidence. That we need to show context, routine, real relationship with the kids. Earl nodded slowly. "What do you think she knows about you?" That question sat in the air a moment. What Connie knew about me. I thought about 17 years of marriage. What she had seen. The technician who left early and came home late, who didn't talk much about work, who had no social media, who didn't go to company functions, who paid the bills on time and never had much to explain about where the money came from because she never asked. "She knows what I showed her," I said. Earl looked at me. "And what didn't you show her?" Silence. "Is there something you didn't show her, Dale?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because the answer had 22 years of federal classification on it and I hadn't told a soul since the day I walked out. I need to explain something before I go further. I'm not going to get into the specifics of what I did between 1999 and 2007. I can't. Part of the agreement I signed when I left included a non-disclosure obligation that's still in effect. What I can say and what the document that reached the judge laid out in summary is this. Between the ages of 26 and 34, I worked as a technical specialist in encrypted communication systems attached to a Defense Intelligence Agency operational unit. My function was the maintenance, calibration, and operation of equipment that was, at the time, considered sensitive enough that personnel involved had their files classified by order of the Department of Defense. I wasn't an agent. I wasn't field personnel. I was a technician. The best they had for that particular system. That's what I was told when I left. I left because I wanted to. Because I was 34 years old and burned out, and I had a girlfriend named Connie Harwell who lived in Nashville and who didn't know anything about that chapter of my life. I married her 3 years later. Never told her. She never asked. Not because I was hiding it, but because I'd put that part of my life away so completely that sometimes I forgot it had happened at all. It was a previous life, a version of myself I didn't recognize in the mirror anymore. The non-disclosure was still active. My file was still classified. My official professional history started in 2008 when I entered the industrial maintenance field. And so, across 17 years of marriage, Connie built the picture she had of me, an average technician, quiet, no real ambitions, no network, no hidden resources. A man she could reduce to a rent payment he could barely make in a custody hearing in front of a judge who'd never laid eyes on me. What she didn't know, what she never thought to ask. Earl and I talked for over 2 hours that morning. I didn't tell him everything. I told him enough. He listened the way an engineer listens to a system that isn't behaving the way it should. That changes the whole picture, he said. Maybe. But I can't just use it however I want. There's a legal process. There's the NDA. You still have contact with anyone from that time? I did. A number for a man I'll call Garrett, no last name, who was still somewhere in the structure and had sent me a birthday text 2 years back, enough to know the channel was still open. Then here's what you need to do, Earl said, pushing his mug to the side. First, document everything you are right now. Routine, income, relationship with your kids, dates, times, specifics. Phil needs factual foundation. Second, find out whether there's a legal path for the existence of that file, not the contents, just the existence, to be submitted as context in a family court proceeding. I looked at him. You know how that works? I spent 31 years dealing with federal bureaucracy, he said. I don't know everything. But I know a classified file isn't a non-existent file, and I know a judge with access to a sealed record can receive things a regular attorney never sees. I asked the question that had been lodged in me since the beginning. What if it doesn't work? He looked at me with an expression that wasn't reassurance. Then you show who you are another way, but try this one first. The weeks that followed were the strangest I've lived. Mornings, up at 5:15, coffee, I-24, 8 hours at the plant with the smell of machine oil and the constant sound of the conveyor lines. Home by 6:30. Dinner. Sleep. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, I was building a file on my own life. Phil Brower was more methodical than I'd expected. In our first 2 meetings, he asked me for something I hadn't anticipated. Not evidence against Connie, but evidence of me. Family court doesn't want to know who the other parent is, he said, sitting across from me with 2 cups of coffee between us. It wants to know who you are. Show me the last 12 months of your kids' lives with you. I spent the next 2 weeks reconstructing. Went to the school and requested attendance records for parent-teacher conferences. I was there for everyone. Pulled the WhatsApp messages with Caleb and Emma from the past 2 years. Hundreds of texts, voice memos, photos, a video of Emma teaching me a hand clap game she'd learned at recess, a picture of Caleb asleep against my shoulder on the bus back from a Predators game. Pulled records for every tuition payment, every insurance premium, every doctor's appointment I'd taken them to. One Saturday, I took the kids to Centennial Park. Emma ran around the Parthenon replica for what felt like an hour straight. Caleb sat with me on the grass and peppered me with questions about how submarines work. I have no idea where that came from, but we went 30 minutes deep into propulsion and pressure but Dad, what if the hatch gets stuck? I filmed them when they weren't looking. Not for evidence, just because I wanted to have it. That week I went to Caleb's school on a Tuesday afternoon without any announcement. No meeting scheduled, or I was just dropping off a gym shirt he'd left behind. The woman at the front desk knew me by name, said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer," without looking up my record, and that detail, being recognized by name in a school I'd been showing up to for years, felt more important than any document. I asked Phil to get a statement from her. He gave me the look attorneys give when they receive a request they never would have thought to make themselves. That might actually help, he said. Shows daily presence, not just formal occasions. I went to the barbecue place on Gallatin Pike and asked the owner, a man named Thurman, who knew my order by heart, if he'd sign a simple statement saying I came in regularly with my kids. He signed it, wouldn't take money for it, and threw in a pound of brisket for the trouble. That was the foundation, but it wasn't enough on its own. On the 18th day after the attorney's call, I dialed Garrett's number. He picked up on the second ring. I won't reproduce the conversation. I'll just say he was quiet for about 10 seconds when I explained the situation. Then he said, "There's a path. It's not fast. It's not guaranteed. You'll need a formal written request citing defense of a fundamental right. Child custody can qualify, depending on the judge. How long? If the judge accepts the request and submits it directly to DOD, you could have something in 2 to 3 weeks. Could hear nothing if the judge doesn't see the relevance." "Understood," I said. I thanked him, hung up, sat in my car in the parking garage of my building for another 40 minutes with the engine off, listening to the ventilation system of the floor above me. The process was in motion. I didn't know if it was going to work. What I knew was that the hearing was in 6 weeks, and that regardless of the federal envelope, I needed everything else documented too. I couldn't rely on just one thing. The complication came in week 3. During those weeks, Connie had called me twice about the kids, a dentist appointment that needed rescheduling, a field trip permission slip we both needed to sign. 2-minute calls, steady voice, no edge. She had no idea what was happening on my side. I knew exactly what was happening on hers. Carrying that asymmetry was uncomfortable, not because it gave me an advantage, but because it reminded me constantly that the clock was running and all I could do was wait and document. One night, Emma sent me a voice memo from Caleb's phone. She didn't have her own yet, saying she'd made a volcano for a science project and wanted me to see it. She sent a blurry photo of something made from cardboard and red tissue paper that was supposed to be lava. I told her it looked great. She sent back 3 heart emojis. I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand for a long time after that. This had to work. Then Caleb called me on a Wednesday at 10 at night, well past when he should have been sleeping, and told me in a low voice that his mom had hired a therapist to meet with him and Emma about adjusting to the new family situation. She asked me if I feel safe at your place. I went quiet. "What did you say?" I said yes. Pause. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm okay. You seem different lately." "Different how?" "Quieter. More than usual." I took a breath. "That's not a bad thing, Caleb. Quiet men think more." A small laugh. "Okay." I hung up, went to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator for no reason, closed it. The therapist was a move I hadn't seen coming. Not illegal, I knew that. But it created a direct line of narrative to my kids, and I had no way of knowing what was being planted there. I called Phil the next morning. "We can request the court appoint an independent custody evaluator for the case," he said. "That neutralizes her private therapist as a unilateral source. Does that slow things down?" "No. It might actually speed it up. It signals you're asking for transparency, not running from evaluation." We filed the request that week. When Connie's attorney got the notification about the independent evaluation, he called Phil to ask why I was making this more complicated than it needed to be. Phil told me, and I almost smiled for the first time in a month. More complicated? No. More precise. The hearing was set for a Thursday in November at 2 in the afternoon. I got to the courthouse at 1:30. I was wearing a suit, the same one I'd worn to my uncle's funeral 4 years back, the only one I owned. Navy tie that Caleb had helped me pick at a department store because I had a school event coming up, and he told me the one I'd been planning to wear was too brown. I sat in the hallway with Phil, and he walked me through it one more time. Connie arrived 10 minutes later with her attorney and Scott, who waited in the public area outside, couldn't come in. She had on a gray blazer, hair back, the same posture she used in boardroom meetings. She didn't look at me. I didn't look at her. The kids weren't present. They'd been interviewed beforehand by the independent custody evaluator. The evaluator's conclusions were in a sealed document the judge had in his folder. We went in. The judge's name was Honorable Thomas Ware, late 50s, gray at the temples, wire-rimmed glasses, the manner of a man who had seen the full spectrum of what people do to each other in family court and had stopped being surprised by any of it. He called the session to order. Connie's attorney went first, presented the statements, the financial documents, the narrative that had been constructed over 14 months, a man without stability, without direction, renting a small apartment, with limited income, unable to provide what the new household could offer. "My children need stability, Your Honor," Connie said when the judge gave her the floor. The voice was the same as always, level, no tremor. My husband can give them a real home. Caleb looked down at his hands. Emma started crying. I didn't say a word. Phil presented our material, everything we'd documented. The independent custody evaluation, which found consistent and strong emotional bonds with both children, structured routine, zero indicators of instability in the observed interactions, the financial records, the messages and photos, Thurman's statement from the barbecue place, the school attendance logs, a letter from Caleb, which he'd written on his own without anyone asking, saying he wanted to keep coming to his dad's house. The judge listened to all of it. No rush. He made notes in pencil. When Phil finished, the judge was still for a moment. He turned pages in the folder. Then he pulled out an envelope that was different from the rest, smaller, with a red stamp I recognized from across the room because the DoD classification seal has a shape that stays with you when you've spent years looking at it. He opened it slowly, read in silence for about 4 minutes, looked up at me. Mr. Mercer. Yes, Your Honor. Do you know why the Department of Defense has a file on you that's been classified for 22 years? Connie's attorney stopped typing on his laptop. Connie turned to look at me for the first time since we'd walked in, and I said, I do. The judge held my gaze for 2 or 3 seconds. You can confirm that this file exists and that it relates to specialized technical work performed in service to the federal government? I can confirm that. He made a note, closed the envelope, placed it back in the folder. This will be entered into the record as professional background context for the respondent. Connie's attorney shifted forward slightly. Your Honor, with respect, I'd like to understand the relevance. Counsel, the judge said without raising his voice. The relevance is this. This court has received a set of allegations regarding the respondent's financial and professional instability. This document, requested by the respondent through formal channels to the Department of Defense and transmitted to this court by institutional correspondence, indicates that the respondent's professional history has dimensions that neither party had presented until this point. That is contextual and material to the character assessment this proceeding requires. Silence. Connie was looking straight ahead. She had stopped writing. Phil was completely still beside me, and I could see from the corner of my eye that he was breathing differently. The judge continued. He presented the result of the independent custody evaluation, consistent emotional bonds, structured routine, complete absence of any instability indicators in the observed interactions. He presented the real financial records, income appropriate to the obligations, payments current, no outstanding debts. He presented school declarations we'd brought, different teachers, different observations, different content than what Connie's attorney had submitted. And then he read a passage from Caleb's letter. I want to keep going to my dad's because there I feel like myself. The apartment is smaller, but when I'm there, I don't feel like I have to act like anything. The judge folded the letter carefully. Joint custody remains in effect without modification, he said. The motion for sole physical custody is denied. Supervised visitation for the respondent is denied for absence of any factual basis to support it. He paused. This court finds that both parents have the capacity to provide a suitable environment for these children. What this proceeding has revealed, however, is an attempt to construct a narrative about the respondent that does not hold up against the documented record. That will be noted in the case file. He looked at Connie. She didn't look away, but I saw her jaw move once. The session was adjourned. We filed out in order, the judge first, then the parties. In the hallway, Connie's attorney went to speak with Phil about the appeal timeline. I stood near a window overlooking a small courtyard with a magnolia tree and a concrete bench that no one ever seemed to use. Connie came over, stopped about 6 feet away. 22 years, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a landing. I was quiet. You never told me. You never asked who I was, Connie. You knew what I did. You never asked who I was. She looked at me for about 5 seconds. My attorney says there are grounds for appeal. You can try. I turned and walked away. In the hallway outside, I passed Scott, Connie's husband, sitting in one of the plastic chairs near the elevator. He looked up at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything. I pushed through the door and into the cold. I didn't feel relief in that moment. That's not what happens when something genuinely ends. I walked out of the courthouse and into the cold air of a Nashville November afternoon, drove up 2nd Avenue with the low sun cutting in through the passenger window, turned on the radio and got a classic country station playing something with a steel guitar that filled the cab of the truck in a way that felt almost wrong for what I was carrying. Pulled into a gas station on Broadway, got a coffee from the machine inside, leaned against the truck for about 15 minutes. The attendant came outside to check something on the pump next to mine, looked at me and said, "You all right, man?" The way people in Nashville do, not intrusive, just noticing. I said I was fine. He nodded and went back inside. What I was feeling wasn't relief. It was something more specific, the particular sensation of a man who has been carrying weight so long that when he puts it down, he has to remember how to stand without it. 3 weeks later, Connie filed the appeal. It was denied in about 10 days, faster than Phil said he'd ever seen a custody appeal turned around. I don't know what the appeals judge wrote. Phil sent me a text. Denied. Custody unchanged. Done. I sent Phil a thank you. I sent Garrett a message that got no reply, but the read receipt came through. That Saturday morning, Earl knocked on my door at 8 with 2 biscuits from the place down the road in a paper bag. "Heard," he said. "How? You had the face of a man who was going to win when you came back from the hearing. Not the face of a man who had won yet, but go, nakor, anarari, nako, in nakor hinar hinnan but going. In nakenmar, in nakenmar hinari." He came in, sat down, put the biscuits on the table. We sat quiet for a while, the 2 of us, coffee in hand, listening to the elevator down the hall. "Thank you," I said. He made a small wave, the gesture of a man dismissing what doesn't need to be said. "Your kids are good," he said. Caleb stopped me in the hallway last month and asked if I knew how to fix a gaming controller. We spent about 45 minutes on it. Couldn't do it, but it was a good afternoon. I looked at him. "You didn't tell me that." "Didn't need to. Here's what I want to say, not as a lesson, because I'm nobody's teacher. As an observation from someone who was inside it. There was a moment during those weeks when I almost lost it. Not in the courtroom. Before. One night, reading through the declarations her attorney had filed for the 3rd time, neighbors I barely knew, a doctor I'd never seen, the careful architecture of a story that had been built brick by brick over months, I felt a very specific urge to do something loud enough that it couldn't be ignored. I didn't do it. Not because I'm particularly disciplined, but because I'd learned, over time and through things I can't talk about, that making noise is the signal of a man who has lost control of the situation. And I hadn't lost it. What Connie did, and she did it with real competence, I'll give her that, was build a version of me I wasn't. She did it with the same talent she used at work, anticipating, documenting, creating structure before acting. The problem wasn't the strategy. The problem was the subject. She spent 17 years with a man and never once asked what that man was before he got to her. She saw the technician who left early, saw the father who picked the kids up, saw the husband who always made the coffee too strong, never asked what existed before any of that. And she didn't ask because in her framework, she didn't need to. What I was to her was enough to define what I was entirely. I know a lot of men like that. Men who got reduced to a function, provider, husband, father, manager, and who, when that function hit a rough patch, found themselves treated as if the crisis of the role was a crisis of the whole person. What the court revealed wasn't a military background. It was the distance between the version of you that someone else builds and what you actually are. That distance can be enormous. And when the truth shows up, it shows up all at once, like opening a window that's been shut too long and having the light come in at an angle that illuminates everything that was sitting in the dark. The question I keep coming back to is this: how many people in your life are working off a version of you that doesn't match who you actually are? Not out of malice, sometimes just habit, convenience, because it's easier not to look too closely at what might complicate a simple story. And what do you do with that? Have you been through something like this? Doesn't have to be a courthouse. Doesn't have to involve custody. Could have been a job, a friendship, a family, someone who decided who you were before they bothered to find out. What did you do when the truth came out? And here's the one I keep turning over. Do you think a person reveals who they really are in someone else's crisis? Not your moment of crisis, the moment when the person next to you is in one. That's when character shows up without a filter. Tell me in the comments. These videos exist because the stories are real and because the questions they leave behind matter more than the endings. If this story landed somewhere in you, hit like. If you know someone who's in the middle of something like this, someone being reduced to a smaller version of themselves, someone who needs to hear that it's possible to stay quiet without losing, share this video with them. Subscribe to the channel. Every week there's a new story, and every one of them is about the same thing. What a man does when the version of him the world built starts to crack, and what he finds is still whole underneath. Until next time. The DoD envelope is still in the drawer of my side table. I haven't reopened it. Don't need to. But sometimes, when Caleb is here on the weekend and he asks about what I did before, because he's 11 and 11 is the age when you start to realize your father existed before he was your father, I look at him and think, someday I'll tell him. Not today. Not because I'm ashamed, or because it's dangerous, or because the agreement stops me from telling my own son, but because some things only make sense when the person listening already has enough inside them to hold it. Caleb's going to have that. I know because I watched him do what he did, write that letter on his own without anyone asking, in the half-cursive half-print of a 6th grader, saying that at my place he feels like himself. That kid's going to be okay. And that, in the end, was the only thing that ever mattered.